Hi folks, my name's Lisa. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be working on our first knit along, a baby blanket, and it is a great project if you are a beginner knitter. It can be done easily. I think you'll enjoy this. It's a quick knit. Even if you're a slow knitter, you'll get this finished in time, and I think you'll be really proud of the results. So let's get started. So this is the baby blanket that we're going to be knitting. Whee! The size is about 3 feet by 3 feet. And the stitches you need to know are... Hold on. Okay, I'm back. My dogs get really excited being here at the beach, so please excuse them if they start barking, but we'll keep going on and get this project started. So like I said, it's a 3 by 3 baby blanket. It has a garter stitch border, and then the rest, whoops, that's the back side, has a garter stitch border, and then the rest is going to be a stockinette stitch body. So you need to know the knit stitch and the purl stitch, and if you have those stitches under your belt, then we can get started and you'll have no problem, and you are going to enjoy this, I am sure. Okay, the supplies you need for this. I am using for this blanket 2 of these balls or skeins. I'm not sure what you call this shape of yarn. It's by Karen and it's called Latte Cake. It gives stripes. So like this one here, the sample I made, is in a yellow, I don't know the color of this one, but it has yellows and browns, and it makes these pretty stripes. And you don't have to switch the yarns to make these. It's already in the ball of yarn that you buy. So 2 of those. And they're not very expensive. I can't remember how much I paid, but I know that it was under $10. The good thing about this yarn is that it's, even though it's synthetic, that's okay because it needs to be something that's machine washable and soft, and this is both. So the baby can get this dirty and you can throw it in the machine and dry it, and it'll come out just as soft as when you originally made it, and it feels really good against the body. It won't irritate a baby, and so that's why I recommend this yarn, and I love the feel of it. And it's going to be an easy knit because you're going to be using size 10.5 knitting needles. Now I use a circular needle for this, even though it's flat knitting, because with a circular needle you can fit a lot of stitches on the needle, and then you won't lose the stitches as you are working a row. Also, I'm traveling. I'm here in Cerritos, Mexico right now, and while I travel I only use circular needles because I'd hate to lose one of my straight needles and then be without a knitting needle for doing a project. So using a circular needle while traveling is also one of my great tips, because you won't lose your project or part of the project as it's in progress. The other thing you might want are knit markers. They're, you don't have to go out and buy little markers to put on the needle to separate the stitch that you're doing. You could use a paper clip or a safety pin or a different color yarn, and then that will help you separate the stitches as you are going to remind you when to knit and when to purl. So let's get started. The gauge you need to get for the baby blanket, it doesn't have to be exact. In fact, this is just a rough estimate, but 15 stitches and 20 rows would be 4 inches. It makes big stitches, that's why it knits fast. Now if you don't get that gauge, I wouldn't stress about it. I would just use this as a rough guideline, and then really whatever the gauge is that you get, because you might knit tighter or looser, it's still going to turn out just fine, and you'll have enough yarn if you have the 2 balls of the latte cake to make it fit just right. But that's the gauge I use. Now it's time to cast on, and we're going to use the long tail cast on method. If you don't know how to do the long tail cast on method, I will put a video link in the show notes below to remind you how to do it, but let's get started with the long tail cast on. So to estimate how much yarn we're going to need for the long tail cast on for this baby blanket, we're going to take the width of the baby blanket, which is 3 feet, and I'm going to estimate an arm's length to be 3 feet, and I'm going to multiply that times 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And so this is where I'm going to make my slip knot to anchor the first stitch to my knitting needle. So let's make a slip knot. This is also in the links below if you need to be reminded how to do a slip knot. I'm going to put that on my knitting needle. And then I'm going to start casting on. And I'm going to cast on 136 stitches. Remember, with the long tail cast on, the long tail yarn is over your thumb, the working yarn's over your finger. You take your knitting needle and go under the thumb, over your finger, through the loop, and off the thumb. Under, over, through, off. Under, over, through, off. And we'll continue. I love knitting at the beach. It's just a nice relaxing thing to do. And I'm here all winter down in Mexico, so I've been knitting a lot. I knit on the drive down here, which took about a week, and then I knit almost every day at the beach. I knit in our studio that we're renting. I knit in the car, going to the store. It's just been a real knitting adventure travel winter. I'm here all winter, and I feel like this is so great because I've been able to have it knit focus. When I'm not knitting, I'm running and surfing, and this past year I didn't do either of those fun things because of COVID, and I just had the lame excuse of not getting out. I just was content staying home, and I took advantage of that a little too much. Whether it was my choice or not during the pandemic, sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't, but there's no excuse not to get out now. Here in Baja California Sur, there's no bad days, and I haven't had a bad day down here. I'm loving it and really enjoying this area of the peninsula in southern Baja. So glad we brought the dogs. Doing a lot of walking on the beach with the dogs. We do about 4 miles of walking on the beach just for the dog's sake. So that's been really great too. Let's see, I better count and see how many stitches I have. Okay, I've cast on 136 stitches. I've counted it twice. I recommend you count your stitches twice so that when you're starting to work on your project, you're not confused about why it's not fitting or doing the right amount for when you're changing stitches. The other thing is I do have a lot of extra yarn from the long tail cast on that I measured. I rather over measure than under measure so that I could just break off this little excess right now. And I'm going to give it like, I don't know, 10 inches. And then I will sew that in at the end with a tapestry needle, and I'll show you how to do that so you have no straggly strings at the end of your project. So before we start the first row, I'm going to go check the surf and see what my dogs are doing because they're barking off and on. So let's check out the surf, and then we'll get to the first row and I'll show you how to do the straight knitting with your circular knitting needles. Oh, the wind's picking up, so I hope you can hear me. But to start knitting flat with your circular knitting needles, you're going to push the stitches up on the left side of the knitting needles. It could be left or right? But the side that has the working yarn attached to it is going to go towards the end of the knitting needle. And then you're going to work garter stitch all the way across the row. So I will knit, the stitches are going to be a little tight the first row, but once you get through that, it'll be nice and loose and easy to work with. So we'll do one row of garter stitch, and then I'll show you how to do the turn with your circular needles to keep it flat. And don't worry about the tail end of the yarn, just hold that maybe with your remainder fingers on your knitting needle, and then you can just start knitting the garter stitch. And as you knit on the circular needles, you're going to keep pushing the stitches up onto the working part of the knitting needle. So every time it's getting hard to knit, just keep pushing the stitches up towards it. If you can hear that saw behind me, it's because they're doing construction here. There is a real estate boom in Cerritos, Mexico, as well as the entire peninsula, really, of southern Baja. And they're building a hotel right next to the beach here, and they are progressing so quickly. It's amazing how fast they can work. I feel like the next time I come here, this whole place will be built up. Right now there's a lot of lots available, but I know that they're being sold and bought really quick. So I imagine the development here is just going to continue to skyrocket. As you are knitting the stitches on the left side and you're pushing stitches up this way, you can take the stitches on your right side and push those down towards the wiry part of the circular needle, just to give yourself some more working space. Just make it comfortable for yourself. About halfway through the first row. Remember, garter stitch to go in, around, through, and over. In, around, through, over. Just keep that mantra, and you won't even be thinking about it soon. You probably already don't even think about it. The great thing about this project is while you're working the main body part in the stockinette stitch pattern, which is knit front side and purl the back side, you probably will get to the point where you won't even be thinking about the process you're working on. You'll just do it automatically because of memory muscle, maybe it's called muscle memory. And then maybe you can start working on it and be doing something else enjoyable as well, like watching your favorite movie. So sitting on the porch, looking at the scenery, or being at the beach like myself, enjoying the sun and the waves. That would be cool. Don't have a drone to show it, although every knitter should have a drone, I am told. But I have gotten to the point where I like to walk and knit, so I have been taking my knitting with me while walking the dogs on the beach, and I just do some mindless knitting as I'm walking down the beach. I call it fit to knit. I feel like I am multitasking to the fullest. I don't always do the walk and knit, but sometimes I feel like doing the multitask, and that's enjoyable to me. Okay, we're finishing up the first row of garter stitch for the baby blanket. It looks a lot of stitches on that needle, but the stitches have loosened up, so this second row is going to be really easy. And so what you do when you finish the row, I just finished my last stitch, all the new stitches have been transferred to the right side of the needle. So my right hand now has the knitting needle and the working yarn in my right hand, and the left side is empty. So just like when you use straight needles, you're going to be turning the work so that the working yarn is in your left hand and the empty needle is in your right. So let's turn the work. Okay, now you have the working yarn in your left hand and the empty needle in your right hand, and that way you're not going to be attaching it so you work in the circular mode like a hat. You're keeping it flat this way. Just always remember, a new row has the working yarn in the left hand and the empty needle in your right hand. If you have it and you do that every row, you won't get this mixed up and you'll be able to continue knitting flat. So, we're going to start the second row of the garter stitch, just as we would with two straight needles. Empty needle into the first stitch of the left needle, and then begin knitting. And just remember, when you're learning to work with circular needles for the first time, to keep the mindset like it's two needles, two straight needles, where the working yarn is in your left hand and the empty needle is in your right hand whenever you start a new row. Okay, now I'm going to be knitting a total of 7 rows of garter stitch. And then I'm going to be placing markers on the 8th row to divide where stitch changes will occur. So when we get to the 7th row, I will show you how to count those rows to make sure you have 7 rows, and I will also show you where to place the stitch markers. So I'll see you back at the knitting circle next time. I failed to mention when I said to do the 7 rows of garter stitch, I was just assuming you already knew what the garter stitch is, but if you don't, garter stitch is when you knit every row. So enjoy the knitting every row for the next 7 rows, and then I'll meet you back here. One thing I wanted to point out while you are working with your circular needles and you're in the middle of the row is you might all of a sudden get confused on where you're working the row. So the way you would know is, while you're knitting the stitches, your working yarn is going to be on the right side of the needle, and the remaining stitches will be on the left side of the needle and will not have any working yarn attached. So look, the working yarn is attached to this right needle. So I know that then that this has to go in my right hand, and then I will be knitting into the stitches on the left needle that have no working yarn attached to it. That's how I know which side, which direction I should be going. So remember, working yarn on the right side of the needle, no working yarn on the left needle. And then you're going to work the stitches on the left needle. You're going to knit into those stitches to create the new stitches. Okay, I have finished the 7 rows, and I am going to show you back home what the 7 rows look like in garter stitch so you can be able to count the rows properly. And I will also be showing you where to place the markers for the stitch changes in the following rows. So until then, I'm going to get suited up and go surf because my husband's coming in and he can watch the dogs while I go out and play. So I'll see you in a little bit. Well, that was fun. Okay, I just finished 7 rows, and you might be asking yourself when you are close to this, did I knit 7 rows, or how can I figure out whether I finished the 7 rows? How do I count garter stitch rows? And I'll show you that, but you also have to consider what side of the fabric is the right side of the fabric and which side of the fabric is the wrong side of the fabric. So let's start with the right side of the fabric. For this project, if you cast on the long tail cast on method, the right side of your project is going to be the side that has the fabric facing you with the long tail cast on tail end of the yarn, this right here at the bottom edge, on the right side. So that means that's the right facing fabric. If you did not cast on the stitches with the long tail cast on method, you can still figure out which side is the right side facing fabric by counting the stitches. So let's start with counting the stitches. Counting rows in the garter stitch is tricky if you aren't sure what you're looking for as a beginner knitter, but once you know what you're looking for, it gets easier. And it's going to be a little tricky with this fuzzy yarn on this baby blanket project. So let's first identify what we're looking for when we count the rows with a swatch that's knit in the garter stitch in a smoother fabric. So what we're looking for are the bumps in the row. So as you can see here, there's bumps and there's rows, and they have bumps in each row. So say for instance this line here has bottom bumps that curve up, and then on top they have the top bumps that curve down. So with each row that you're counting, a row that has the upward curves is considered one row, and then the next row is the row that has the downward curves, so that's the second row. And then you look for the next bump line above that, which is the upward curves. That's another row. And then above that is the downward curves. And that's a subsequent row. And if you're knitting a garter stitch, it's going to be upward curve row, downward curve row, upward curve row, downward curve row. And those are what you're counting when you're counting rows. So let's look at our baby blanket. We have here the 7 rows, we think, and I have it as front facing fabric with the tail end of the cast on yarn on the right side, and I've chosen that to be my front facing fabric, although it's easy to choose either side as your front facing fabric. If you make an error even in counting the rows, you still can make this work out, so just try your best to count the rows. So here we have lines of bumps going up. When you're counting the rows, don't count the cast on row, which is the bottom selvage. You're looking for the next bump sequence above that, and you're looking for an upward curve bumps. So you have the cast on selvage row, but we're not counting that in our knit rows. And then we're going to go up one till we find the upward facing curves, which is right here. And that's our first row. And then on top of that would be the downward facing curves. And that's row number 2. And since this was a downward facing, the next row we're looking for is upward, which is right above it. That's row number 3. And on top of that is downward facing curves. That would be row number 4. And then above that we're looking for upward facing curves. That's row number 5. And then above that is the downward facing curves. That's row number 6. And then there's no more bump curves above that. All that's left are the stitches on the needle. But those stitches on the needle are actually a row that you've knit. So that would be row number 7. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I have knit 7 rows. Now I'm ready to place the markers onto the needle to separate where I'm going to make stitch changes in the following rows. Now that we have counted the 7 rows, we're ready to knit the 8th row, and we'll be using our stitch markers on this row to place them on the needle to mark the stitches where stitch changes will happen in future rows. So we're going to start by knitting 6 stitches. 2, 4, 6, and then we're going to place our first marker on the needle, and then we're going to take the yarn and we're going to bring it to the front, and we're going to purl 124 stitches. That's purling until there's 6 stitches left on the left side of the needle. Okay, getting close to the end of the row. Two, 4, 6, a couple more. Okay, so now we have 6 stitches left on the left needle, and before we knit those, we are going to place the stitch marker on the right needle, and then we're going to take the yarn and put it towards the back because we're going to knit those last 6 stitches. Okay, we're finished with that row. Let's do the second row of this pattern sequence. We're going to turn the piece over. So the cast on row with the long tail yarn that's on the bottom is facing on the right side, and that's showing that this is the right side of the fabric. And so for all right side fabrics, you're going to knit the entire row. So you're going to knit the first 6 stitches. Slip the marker onto your right needle and continue knitting until you get to the next marker, and then you're going to slip that marker and finish the row knitting. Okay, we're approaching the second marker. We're finishing the knit in the body. We're going to slip the marker to the right needle, and we're going to finish knitting by knitting the last 6 stitches. And then we're going to continue going to the wrong side of the fabric, where we'll be always knitting the first 6 and last 6 stitches of every row, and then the only change will be on the wrong side of the row you're going to purl the body's main stitches, and on the right side of the row you're going to knit the body's main stitches. So just follow that sequence. Wrong side, you're going to knit 6, purl 124, and knit the last 6. On the right side, you're going to knit all the stitches. And you're going to do this until the piece measures 35 inches. So for the pattern sequence for the body, you're knitting on each side the first and last 6 stitches, and then on the front side of the fabric, you're knitting all the center body stitches. And on the back side of the fabric, this is what it looks like because you're purling. So here it'd be knit and purl. Here it's knit and knit. Isn't that pretty? Can't wait to see what you do. I'm going to keep knitting this project until I finish the first ball of yarn, and that's when I'll check in with you again and show you where to end your row when finishing that first ball of yarn, and then how to transfer the second ball of yarn onto your project with the long tails of the yarn still remaining. But that won't be a big deal. I'll teach you how to weave in those ends so you can't tell where one ball of yarn ends and one ball of yarn begins. And so, happy knitting until then, and I'll check back with you soon. I have finished the first ball of yarn for the baby blanket, and now it's time to attach the second ball. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So here we've knit the first ball of the latte cakes yarn, and it's time to attach the second ball of yarn. And the first thing you need to know is where to end the first ball of yarn tail and where to begin the second yarn tail. Yarn tail meaning the end of the yarn. So when you're knitting your project, don't end the yarn in the middle of the row. End it on either end of the row. So this one I finished at the end of the row, and here's the remainder of the yarn tail. And so the reason you want it at the sides of the row and not in the middle is because when you are weaving in the yarn tails at the end, it'll make it a much cleaner process, and you won't be able to tell where the old yarn ends and the new yarn begins. So since we ended this yarn at the end of the row, I'm going to give it about 10 inches of yarn and break it off here. So when attaching the second yarn to your project, you're going to start the first stitch by knitting the right needle into the left needle, creating the X. And then you're going to take your new yarn and you're going to wrap it around the right needle and hold the 2 strands of yarn together as you create that loop and create that first stitch. Now it's going to be loose on the end here, but don't worry about that yet. Just start your second stitch, and on the second stitch, don't take the end tail, take the working yarn and create that knit stitch. And now you can continue knitting with the working yarn as you start your new row. Okay, so now that we have attached the second ball of yarn of the latte cakes to the baby blanket, I will meet you back here when your piece measures 35 inches from the beginning. So measure from the very first row that you cast on, and when it gets to 35 inches, it'll be time to go back to the garter stitch to create the border, the final border, because you're almost done with your project. So I'll see you next time. So for the baby blanket, I have reached 35 inches from the bottom. I measured from the first row that I cast on up to the knitting needles, and that's 35 inches. So now I'm going to knit every row, and then I'm going to be binding off. So while I'm driving in the car today, work at the same time with knitting those rows, and I'll show you the bind off. Okay, so the border has been knit. I knit 6 rows of border pattern for the end border. Once you finish the 6 rows, you will have just finished the wrong side row for your 6th row. And now we're going to bind off. Remember to bind off in pattern, so you're binding off in the knit stitch. And you're going to do that for the whole row. Start binding it off. Losing my needle. But I'm on a circular needle while driving, so I'm not going to lose it somewhere in the car, which is one benefit of using the circular needle while knitting and traveling. Oh my gosh, there it goes again. Fell out. There we go. So we'll continue this, and then I'll meet you back here when I finish the binding off. And once that is done, we will be weaving in the tails. I'll show you where we are. I'll show you where we are. We're still in Mexico. Okay, so congratulations, you finished knitting your baby blanket, and it should look something like this, with these cute borders that were done in the basic garter stitch. Here's one of my blankets, and then here is the other blanket. This one, I was playing around with the yarn, and you could tell I only have a little stripe there, but it's what makes it interesting. But now I need to sew in those tail ends that are at the beginning and ending of the blanket, as well as when we switched the skeins of yarn. So those are there. And so I'm going to show you now how to sew in those yarn tails. You'll sew them in a certain way so that it allows stretch in the knit when you wash it and when it's wrapped around some baby. And also it'll make it so there's no bumps, like you're not tying a knot or anything, because that makes it a little sloppy. And this is just good practice to use for whenever you're sewing in yarn tails. You could use this to any project you make. Okay, so when sewing in your yarn tails, you need a tapestry needle. Just go and invest in one of these. You'll use this always when finishing your knitting, or to tie in yarn tails if not sewing the seams. So the tapestry needle, and I'm going to use a contrasting yarn just to show you what this looks like when weaving in your yarn tails, and so you can get an idea of how you're supposed to do this. And to start, and I was just recently reminded of this, on the back side of your project, so that's why there's a right side and a wrong side. So the baby blanket, this stockinette stitch with the knit stitch showing in the body is your right side, and then the wrong side would be the side that shows the purl stitches. So on this, we're pretending this is the wrong side, and on the wrong side is the purl stitches, and the bumps are some people in the knitting community call umbrellas and smiles. And when you look at the bumps, it makes sense, the umbrellas and the smiles. So the first thing you're going to go do is you're going to take your tapestry needle and you're going to go up 2 bumps that are directly one on top of the other in different rows. So I'm using a smile bump here, and then I'm going to go to the smile bump just above it. And then I'm going to pull the string through and keep a little tail here. And then I'm going to go, I went up the smile, so I'm going to go up over the umbrella and down the next smile bump, which is directly to the left of the top smile bump you went through. And I'm going to then go diagonally. I went through a smile, I'm going to go diagonally through an umbrella bump right beneath it. It's going to be diagonally to your right. So just to stop here and remind you, the first 2 bumps I went through were right on top of each other, so it was a smile and a smile. The next bumps that I go through with the tapestry needle are going to be a smile and then an umbrella. And it's going to be at a slight diagonal towards the right. And so this loop here is going to take the form of the umbrella stitch that it's mimicking right here. I don't know if you can see the umbrella stitch, but there's the umbrella. And then this contrasting pretend yarn tail is going to mimic that umbrella by going through those 2 stitches. And now we're at the bottom row. And since we just went through the umbrella bump, we're going to go around the smile, and we're going to go up an umbrella bump, and we're going to go up that umbrella bump, and then we're going to go to the right to get into the smile bump that we previously went through. And then we're going to pull. So now we've just mimicked the smile bump. It's basically going around the umbrella and down the smile and then back into an umbrella bump, because you're going back into the stitches that you previously sewed through. That way you can follow the line of bumps. So I just went through the umbrella. Now I'm going to go through the smile bump and then take my needle and go through the next umbrella bump. And then I'm going to go diagonally back into the stitch, the bump that is the smile. So we have umbrella, smile, oops, and then we've got smile, umbrella. Umbrella, umbrella, smile, smile, umbrella. Umbrella, smile, smile, umbrella. It's just repeating that pattern. So umbrella, smile, sorry. Umbrella, smile, smile, umbrella. Umbrella, smile, smile, umbrella. So you're following the pattern of the bumps, and what you're creating is a way to, you don't have to do as many stitches as I just did. You only have to do like 3 or 4, and then you can cut these off. And you can cut these pretty close to the fabric, right? And then on the right side, especially if this did not have a contrasting yarn, you would not see the yarn tail that has just been woven in. Okay, so let's try this on the baby blanket. So I'm going to thread my tapestry needle. And then we'll weave in this first yarn tail. I'm going to take a couple stitches away from the selvage, the edge. So maybe like here. And then I'm going to go in through the first bump, which is a smile here. So right above it, I'm going to take another smile bump in the next set of rows. I'm going to go up. And then I'm going to follow the garter stitch pattern here. And I'm going to go over the umbrella, back down to the smile bump, and then diagonally into the umbrella bump to the slight right of it. There we go. And then I'm going to go under the smile and through the umbrella, diagonally to the smile, over the umbrella, down to the smile, and then smile to the umbrella stitch, and then the smile, umbrella to the smile, and umbrella to the smile to the umbrella. Hope that's not too confusing. You're basically just weaving in and out of the garter stitch bumps so that you can then cut this stitch off at the base of the fabric and it shouldn't unravel. So you're going to do that with all the loose tails, and then you have to decide whether to block or not. So once you've woven in your yarn tails, the final thing you need to decide what to do is whether to block your project or not to block it. There's lots of different schools of thought on this. Because this was knit with latte cakes, which it's synthetic, I find synthetics are more difficult to block. And for this too, the border already has created a nice straight solid edge, so it's not, in my mind, it's not necessary to block, but that's completely up to you. I mean, if you can block synthetics well, then go for it because it will make it neater. But if you are uneasy about blocking synthetics, then I would just stick to it being finished, because this is the kind of blanket, hopefully, that will be used a lot and go through the wash and dryer constantly if you're using it with a baby to keep it clean. And you're not going to block it every time you wash it and put it through the dryer. So I think it's great the way it is. I'm happy to give it to someone as a gift like this. I think it'll get good use, and they'll think of you every time they wear it, and you'll be hugging them every time they're not near you because you made this special blanket for them. So congratulations, and thanks for doing the knit along with me, and I hope you'll join me again for another knit along, and we'll learn some more and have some more fun. So thanks.